I used to think of money as something fleeting, something that comes and goes, and believed that wealth or lack thereof is simply a matter of fate. That's why I chose Sikandar. I thought people from middle-class families were more sincere. I believed they wouldn't cheat on their wives or get involved in secret affairs. I saw them as sensitive and protective toward their spouses, unable to bear seeing their wives with someone else because of their innate jealousy. To me, sincerity was more important than wealth, so I chose to prioritize loyalty over money. My parents tried to stop me. They warned me against marrying someone who couldn't even meet my basic needs and said I'd regret my decision for the rest of my life. But I silenced them by pointing out that even in our family, there are men with plenty of money and beautiful wives who still pursue affairs. Such men often have multiple women, one visible to everyone and another hidden from view, someone they maintain a secret relationship with. I insisted that I valued sincerity above all else, even if it meant I might later regret my decision. I told them that I could compromise on basic needs, but I would never accept a husband who cheated on me. I argued that it would be completely unfair for my husband, the very person for whom I distanced myself from others, to then betray me and form relationships with other women. For this reason, I pleaded with my parents to accept Sikandar's proposal. Yes, he came from a middle-class family, but sincerity was woven into his very being. I believe that men from such backgrounds were loyal, didn't frequent late-night parties, and certainly didn't visit questionable establishments. I told my parents they might not trust him, but I did. I believed that our love marriage would succeed, and I urged them not to worry. After all, I was their only child, and I would never have financial issues because everything they owned would be mine anyway. Most importantly, I believed my husband would stay loyal to me. After days of arguing with my parents, I finally asked Sikandar and his family to bring a proposal. I truly thought he was sincere, but time proved my parents were right. I regret that decision to this day. Soon after, Sikandar and I got married, just as we'd planned. He had been my classmate, and we had spent our final semester at university together. People looked at us with admiration, and I felt increasingly proud of my choice. I used to remind my parents how right I'd been, and they seemed content to see me so happy. 2 years into our marriage, my mother-in-law became fixated on one thing. She wanted to become a grandmother. During the first 2 years, Sikandar and I chose not to have children because we wanted to enjoy our life together. Being her only son, my mother-in-law had many dreams centered on Sikandar. By the time I started wanting children too, we tried hard, but it just wasn't happening. Years went by, and doctors eventually informed us that I could never become a mother. When I broke this devastating news to Sikandar, his reaction was surprisingly calm. He reassured me, saying that it was not a problem and that we could adopt a child from an orphanage. Yet deep down, I began to worry. What if he left me because of this? What if his mother's pressure led him to seek another wife? These fears gnawed at me, especially as I knew how much his mother longed for grandchildren. Despite my anxieties, Sikandar remained loyal. We adopted a child and began to raise them as our own. It felt as though our lives were finally complete. Living with Sikandar taught me many things, the most important of which was to respect my parents. He showed me how to stand by my opinions without yelling or being disrespectful, something I had struggled with. I had a tendency to lose my temper and speak harshly, especially to my parents. In our society, such behavior had almost become normalized, even considered a tradition by some. But Sikandar's attitude toward my parents and his own set a different example. He treated my parents with immense respect and care, and when it came to his own parents, he went above and beyond. It was almost as if he revered them. Watching him treat his parents with such devotion made me realize the importance of family bonds. It made me believe that our adopted children would grow up embodying those same values. Over time, we took in 3 children from the orphanage, and no one in our community ever suspected that I couldn't have biological children. My mother-in-law and husband both kept this secret, ensuring no one could tell that the children weren't our own. However, 10 years into our marriage, things started to change. Sikandar's behavior shifted, and I began to feel a distance between us. Even though we now had children, and they were growing older and becoming more aware of the world, Sikandar seemed more withdrawn. Our children often noticed things and asked me questions about their father. They would ask why he came home late at night or why he acted differently. One day after returning from school, the children came to me and said they had seen their father in a car with another woman. I didn't take their words too seriously at first. I assumed it was likely a work-related meeting or some office matter. After all, in the 10 years of our marriage, nothing like this had ever happened. I convinced myself that my husband would never be unfaithful. I dismissed the children's observations, thinking they must have mistaken someone else for their father. But it was this nonchalant attitude that ultimately brought me to this point of doubt and heartbreak. Over time, little things began to add up. One evening, instead of calling a Sikandar on his mobile, I decided to call his office directly. I was told he wasn't there. I thought he might have stepped out, but when I asked him about it the next morning, he claimed he had been at the office the whole time. I wanted to trust him, so I dismissed it as a misunderstanding. However, as the weeks passed, this pattern repeated itself. Every time I called the office in the evening, I was told he wasn't there, yet Sikandar continued to insist that he was. Our arguments over this grew more frequent, and a strain settled over our relationship. We started spending hours without speaking to each other. The tension became almost unbearable. I hadn't yet revealed to him that I knew he wasn't actually at the office during those times. Instead, I decided to keep my suspicions to myself and quietly investigate. I tried to act as if everything was normal, hoping to find out what was really happening. Memories of what the children had said came flooding back. They had mentioned seeing their father with another woman, and I had brushed it off. But now that seed of doubt began to grow. One day I noticed something that made my heart sink. There was a lipstick stain on Sikandar's shirt. The color wasn't something I owned. I never wore red lipstick. It was a vivid mark, one I couldn't ignore. In that moment, my fears and suspicions seemed to be confirmed. But instead of confronting him right away, I decided to wait, to gather more evidence before bringing up something so serious. My mind was filled with questions. Was this a misunderstanding, or was there more to the story than he was willing to admit? As the days passed, I became increasingly torn, unsure whether to leave Sikandar or try to work through what was happening. That one small lapse of attention had placed me at a crossroads, and I no longer knew what the future held for us. Even on my wedding day, I never thought something like this could happen. So whose lipstick was it that I found on my husband's shirt? My first suspicion was that he had started going to places like those frequented by certain types of women, as that behavior was quite common in our society. I decided to call his office and asked where he was. They told me that he had stepped out with a friend. When I inquired which friend, the woman on the other end of the line replied that he was usually out with a different woman every day. She expressed sympathy for me and even suggested that I keep a closer watch on him, noting that there had been a lot of talk about him at the office recently. She even recommended that I visit the office one day. Hearing this, I became deeply troubled. I couldn't fathom that at this stage in life, when most people would leave behind such immature behavior, my husband was apparently spending his time with women half his age. I began to recall my parents' warnings. They had been right all along, but I couldn't absolve myself of blame either. I had become so engrossed in our children that I hadn't paid enough attention to my husband. Perhaps this lack of attention had driven him to seek it elsewhere. The next day, I visited the office unannounced. Sikandar's face paled when he saw me. It was clear that he hadn't expected me to show up. Inside his office, I found a young woman sitting with him. She left quickly when I gave her a suspicious look. Sikandar fumbled, claiming she was his secretary. I didn't push further, choosing to leave shortly after. I started following him. When I couldn't do so myself, I hired someone to keep track of his whereabouts. For the first time in our 10-year marriage, I felt compelled to monitor his every move. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. I was certain something was going on. I only needed to catch him in the act. I traced his phone number, which revealed that he was at a nearby hotel. The informant told me that he was there with another woman. Without hesitation, I went to the hotel and booked the room next to theirs. I waited for the right moment before knocking on his door. When he opened it, he was wearing only a nightgown and looked annoyed at being disturbed. At first, he thought it was room service, but his expression changed completely when he saw me standing there. His face froze in shock. I didn't say a word and simply walked past him into the room. Inside, I found a woman dressed inappropriately. When she saw me, she quickly tried to cover herself with a blanket. Furious, I grabbed her by her hair and forced her to stand. She looked at me in disbelief. A moment later, we were grappling with each other, both fighting over a man who was both my husband and her lover. As we fought, Sikandar finally stepped in between us and shouted, "Stop it! Both of you! Stop fighting!" I looked at him with burning anger. "What do you think? You can have affairs and I'm just supposed to stay quiet? Is that what you thought? That I wouldn't find out?" I was seething with rage as I confronted him. The woman quickly got dressed and fled the room. Sikandar, instead of showing remorse, glared at me with anger. He got dressed, dragged me out of the hotel, and shoved me into the car. He drove home recklessly, and when we arrived, the children were terrified to see us yelling at each other. I quickly asked the nanny to take the children to their room so we could sort things out privately without affecting the kids' well-being. My husband understood this too, so he remained silent until they were gone. Once the children were out of sight, an intense argument broke out between us. He blamed me, and I blamed him. Both of us hurled accusations, each claiming the other had changed. My husband said that I no longer dressed up for him the way I used to. He accused me of prioritizing the adopted children over him, claiming I had stopped caring about him altogether. When he used the word adopted, it felt like a knife to my heart. I had never imagined that he would throw such a remark at me. I, in turn, accused him of being unfaithful, spending nights with other women while I waited for him at home. This argument created a chasm between us, one that grew so wide that we ended up living in separate rooms. I thought that by doing so, he might come to his senses, give up his escapades, and come back to me. On the other hand, he believed he was in the right. What had started as a disagreement turned into a standoff fueled by pride and ego. Both of us clung stubbornly to our positions. Months passed, with neither of us willing to yield. It's often said that infidelity in a relationship typically begins with the man. Eventually, the woman, feeling neglected and hurt, may begin to act out in similar ways. When my husband distanced himself from me, leaving me yearning for the attention he once gave me, I made a decision that I now deeply regret. I tried to make him jealous, to show him that if he could behave that way, so could I. Out of sheer spite and an overwhelming need to retaliate, I formed a superficial connection with a household employee I had hired to keep tabs on my husband's activities. This relationship was not genuine. There was no emotional or physical intimacy, but I wanted my husband to think there was. I wanted him to feel the same sting of jealousy that I had felt every time I imagined him with another woman. But my plan backfired. Instead of correcting his behavior, my husband became even more brazen. He started openly meeting other women, even frequenting places known for illicit encounters. I began receiving videos that showed him in compromising situations. He was well aware that I had someone monitoring his every move, but it didn't deter him. I seethed with anger and jealousy, silently plotting how to make him understand the pain he was causing me. I wanted him to feel the kind of hurt I felt whenever I thought about him with someone else. The rising blood pressure, the burning jealousy that gnawed at my insides. The only way I could think of teaching him this lesson was to show him how it felt. Sometimes, no matter how much you tell someone their actions are hurting you, they won't truly understand until they experience the same behavior themselves. I began dressing provocatively and attending social gatherings with my employee. These were not ordinary gatherings, but parties held in certain clubs where men and women danced together. I wanted my husband to see the videos, to feel the same fury and jealousy that consumed me. When he eventually saw the footage, he was furious. He confronted me and told me to stop, but I replied that I would only stop when he did. As a traditional man, he couldn't tolerate seeing his wife in such situations, let alone with a mere employee. And that was exactly what I wanted, to make him realize how deeply his actions had hurt me. However, my little charade took an unexpected turn. The employee, who knew I was doing all of this to provoke my husband, started taking advantage of the situation. He began to feel emboldened, as though he had more power than he actually did. One day, he drugged me. In my compromised state, I lost control of my actions and ended up doing something I never thought I would. It was a moment of profound weakness, one that left me deeply ashamed. Worse still, he recorded it. That video became a tool for him to blackmail me. I was devastated. I had started out trying to make my husband jealous, hoping he'd realize the pain he was causing and come back to me. Instead, I ended up being manipulated and blackmailed. I felt as if I had hit rock bottom. Even as my husband began showing signs of caring again, stopping by to check on me under the pretense of the children, I was caught in a web of my own making. He started to pull away from the other woman, but by that time my plan had spiraled out of control. The employee had turned from a simple pawn in my scheme into a source of constant stress and humiliation. I now see how my actions backfired. By trying to fight fire with fire, I only made things worse for myself. In my attempt to teach my husband a lesson, I ended up hurting my own self-respect. The entire situation was a downward spiral, fueled by anger, pride, and the desperate need to feel valued. In the end, no one came out unscathed. My husband was furious, the children were scared, and I was left struggling to find a way out of the mess I had created. The employee had become like a bottomless pit. No matter how much money I gave him, it was never enough. Fed up with his manipulative behavior, I finally reported him to the police, and he was sentenced to a long prison term. But I couldn't absolve myself of blame. I had allowed him to get close, creating a situation where he could take advantage of me. Still, the greater fault lay with my husband, who had shattered our marriage's foundation through infidelity. His actions not only disrespected our bond, but also caused me immense humiliation in society. Unfortunately, where we lived, this sort of behavior wasn't seen as unusual. It was almost customary for people to pursue extramarital relationships, even when married. Ironically, I found myself slipping into the same patterns I once despised. But it didn't take long for me to grow tired of it. Deep down, I knew I was incredibly sensitive about my husband. The idea of giving him a taste of his own medicine, of playing the same game, began to feel pointless. I realized that if I were to look at another man inappropriately, it would only perpetuate a cycle. What I did, he might do in return, and our relationship would spiral further out of control. I understood that the principle of reciprocal actions often dictates the dynamics of any relationship. Recognizing this, I repented and decided to give our marriage another chance. This decision couldn't be made by me alone. It required both my husband and me to work together. I resolved to speak to him, to address how our fights were taking a toll on our children's well-being. Both of us had made mistakes, and we were equally at fault. It was our shared burden to fix things. On our wedding anniversary, I took the first step. At around 2 in the afternoon, I dressed up, determined to surprise my husband. I assumed he would remember the significance of the day. Every year, we had always spent our anniversary together, even after having children. Things had changed drastically since then, but I still held on to the hope that our bond could be mended. I told myself I would do whatever it took to save our marriage. I wouldn't let pride get in the way. After all, pride was part of what had driven us apart in the first place. It had been so long since I had dressed up just for him, and I hoped this effort would remind him of what we once shared. When I arrived at his office, however, I was told that he hadn't come in that day. Instead, he had gone to the farmhouse. Every year, we used to spend our anniversary at the farmhouse. I thought perhaps he had gone ahead to plan a surprise for me, just as I had planned to surprise him. Despite his recent anger, I wanted to believe he hadn't completely forgotten what day it was. Maybe he had something special prepared for me after all. Filled with cautious optimism, I decided to head to the farmhouse. I wanted to think that he too was willing to give our relationship another chance. Neither of us could truly live without the other, or so I believed. But I was well aware of his recent behavior. The path he had taken in recent times was something I couldn't ignore. I knew that if I were to find him with another woman, I needed to remain calm. This wasn't about creating more drama or making the situation worse. I had to approach him with understanding, even if it hurt me deeply. I was prepared to talk to him gently, to explain why we needed to fix things for the sake of our family. If he refused to change, I had resolved that I would ask for a divorce. The thought of divorce terrified me. It sent chills down my spine. I couldn't imagine the reality of us separating forever. In truth, I didn't want a divorce at all. I wanted to rebuild what we had lost, to salvage the life we had built together. In my heart, I was willing to do anything to avoid that outcome. If it meant allowing him to marry another woman, I would accept that. But divorce was something I simply couldn't bring myself to consider. In our society, divorce was often seen as a failure. Women who divorced were looked down upon, as though they hadn't tried hard enough to make things work. I had always disapproved of how quickly some women would leave their husbands, running back to their parents' homes over minor disagreements. I didn't want to become one of those women. I didn't want to be the wife who walked away at the first sign of trouble. No matter how difficult things got, I wanted to fight for my marriage, to find a way to heal the wounds we had both inflicted on each other. My determination to save my marriage wasn't just for myself. I thought of my children and the life we had built together. I thought of the promises we had made on our wedding day. Most of all, I thought of the love that had once been so strong between us. I wanted to believe that love still existed somewhere beneath the surface, waiting to be reignited. With that hope in mind, I continued my journey to the farmhouse, prepared to face whatever lay ahead. When I arrived at the farmhouse, I was surprised by the lavish arrangements. The guard seemed startled and nervous when he saw me. He hesitated, then said, "Ma'am, you're here?" I simply replied, "Yes. Where is your boss? Where is he?" He reluctantly pointed inside, but before I walked away, he stopped me. "Ma'am," he said hesitantly, "he comes here every day with a girl." I met his eyes and said, "I already know." As I entered, I found my husband, Sikandar, dressed up and clearly expecting someone else. He was shocked to see me. "You're here? Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice edged with surprise. He must have assumed that I would react as I had the last time I caught him with another woman. For weeks he had been holding on to divorce papers, yet I had come to the farmhouse not to end our marriage, but to try and salvage what we had left. I sat down on the sofa, preparing to have a conversation with him, when the other woman arrived. The moment she saw the two of us together, her face turned pale with worry. She knew exactly who I was, Sikandar's first wife, and remembered the time I had struck her in anger. She started to back away, but I stopped her. I invited her to sit down, keeping my tone calm and deliberate. "Listen," I began, "I love Sikandar deeply, and I have no intention of seeking a divorce. I only got involved with that servant to make him jealous, to bring him back to me, but it didn't work. Now I realize that you two have real feelings for each other, and I want you to marry him. I don't want our constant fighting to hurt our children any longer." The woman seemed taken aback by my words. "I'll only marry him on one condition," she said, her voice firm. "You must divorce him. I will never accept being a co-wife." I glanced at Sikandar, who was sitting there, clearly ashamed. He must have been thinking about all the fights we had been through and how, even now, I had come here to offer reconciliation rather than retaliation. Perhaps he realized that I had the moral high ground. Yet I had chosen to apologize, to try to save what remained of our relationship. He looked as though he was beginning to understand the consequences of the double life he had been leading. It turned out that his main reason for involving himself with this woman was pressure from his parents. They had wanted grandchildren, and Sikandar had become desperate. He had met several women over time, but none of them were willing to marry him while I was still in the picture. This woman had been the only one he thought might be willing to stay with him. A heated argument broke out between us. We had argued before, but this time it was different. The other woman's presence made everything more volatile. My husband, visibly angered, pushed her away and slapped her across the face. "If you ever touch my wife, I'll break your hands. Who do you think you are? You're nothing more than a mistress," he yelled, his voice filled with rage. She was stunned into silence. I felt conflicted. On one hand, I was relieved to see him defend me, but on the other, I felt pity for her. Tears filled her eyes as she stood. "Don't ever contact me again," she said before storming out. That left only Sikandar and me, facing each other in the aftermath. He was overcome with remorse, apologizing over and over again. I listened quietly and then said, "Why don't we give this marriage one more chance?" And that's what we did. We never divorced, and from that day forward, Sikandar never broke my trust again. He remained loyal, and we rebuilt our life together. To our astonishment, God blessed us with children. The doctors had been wrong all along. Now we had 4 children, each one a precious gift. We never once treated them differently, and we made a pact never to bring up the mistakes of the past. Instead, we focused on treating each other with greater care and understanding than ever before. Over time, I learned that the power to hold a family together often rests in a woman's hands. A woman can build a home or destroy it, and that choice is hers alone. By choosing forgiveness, by letting go of ego, and by working towards reconciliation, I was able to save my marriage. Today, we are stronger and happier because we chose to hold on, to fight for each other, and to learn from our mistakes. That is the lesson I carry with me, that no matter how hard the journey, the reward of rebuilding something meaningful is always worth the effort.